Just keep my questions. We wanted to actually open up the floor. If any one of you have questions, we want to give you the opportunity to ask. So feel free, and you can direct your question even if you like. And then I have some prepared questions as well, which I'll interject here and there. But yeah, let's hear from you guys.
Yeah, I've got a question. I think we'd all appreciate sort of a nutshell description from the team what a journey to your village is like.
Like just getting into our village.
Like from here to there.
Oh, okay.
Leave with your suitcase.
Yeah. Oh, you can pull in. Okay, so from here, you've got to get to. There's multiple ways there. You obviously have to fly internationally. So for us, it's a family of 4 with 2 kids. So, but basically, we catch on an international flight that can go through Brisbane, or Singapore, or Manila, or Hong Kong. Currently with COVID, it's somewhat restricted, so most likely route back would be either Hong Kong or Brisbane. And then from there, that's a reasonable, normal ticket on an international flight. But then from there, that's about, how many hours of flying? About 24 hours of flying in total. And then you've still got to get into Papua New Guinea, which is a few hours, depending where you fly from, which is about 3 to 5 hours, maybe 7. And then once you get into Papua New Guinea, now because of COVID, we'll have to quarantine up to 3 weeks and so on. But then from there, we need to fly into an airport, which is sort of with a small plane, either with a little small plane, 8-seater, or a commercial flight. We'll fly to a town, either Madang, which is in our province, or you'll fly into the highlands where the missions bases of New Tribes or Summer Institute of Linguistics, which we use. We can fly there, and then from there, it is a helicopter flight of about half an hour into our village. And so if you don't take the heli, you must fly to Madang, take a dinghy, like a 4-meter dinghy, over the Astrolabe Bay, which takes about 4 or 5 hours. And depending on the time of the year, the water is either choppy or not. And then you get to a place called Biliao, which is like seriously dodgy place. And you'd have to sleep over there, and then it would take you about a day, take us a day to hike into the village from there. Basically starting in a coastal plain, but slowly but surely going through hills, and eventually hitting the last stretch when you're really tired. That's when you hit the jungle mountain, and you'll have to come in from there. That's white man, what they call a white man hiking. For them it's just a few hours. But, and very often just in the village they'll say, no, you can't go there, you'll die. Hiking is very intense. But yeah, Alan, it's a long journey, and it's exceptionally expensive. Yeah.
So overall, 24 hours?
No. To get into the village is about 40 maybe. Yeah, it's days.
And you also have to allow time in there for, like, the heli can't fly if it's cloudy. And so we have to leave days where you're like, well, if it doesn't get in today, it might be able to get in tomorrow. So that makes it longer too.
So typical journeys for us are, we'll go out the village every 6 months, and we'll go to Madang or the highlands and take a break, but it's all helicopters. So it's fun. I've flown in a heli more than anyone, I'm pretty sure. So we all have. So, great, that's a good question.
Maybe on that, if you could just, am I right in saying if we look at modern missions today, it's either going to be remote or it's going to be very dangerous, as in a persecuted, like a blocked country, like an Islamic country.
Yeah.
If we're talking about unreached,
if we're focused on like are unreached places.
Yeah.
I'm just got two categories.
Yeah, kind of, if you look at like the tip of the sphere, where people are either unreached or there's restriction, where it's just not safe to preach the gospel, or where people just haven't gone there because it's so hard to get there.
Yeah, those are two categories to think of. You've got places where the gospel has never been, right? Our village doesn't fall in that category. It might, like a biblical gospel was not there. But if you look at what's that book? What's that book where they got all the missions? Operation World or something. Right, there's a book. It's going to say Papua New Guinea is Christian, like 90%, but that's not biblically accurate. There are some churches in our mountains, even that would be a biblical church. It's just a really hard to reach place physically. But there are places where there is no gospel. Those are shrinking the amount, but they're there. And then there's restricted, right? China, India's got a lot of restriction. Africa has places, Sudan, wherever. So, yeah. I don't know if you have another category.
Yeah, no, I also think it's just unreached places are already persecuted or just very isolated usually.
Yeah, so the idea is even in our mountains are a specific range, and that's where we're focused. And within that range, there are 70 language groups. So linguistically, there are 70 languages. There's 14 or 15 groupings. And what we're doing is we're aiming to see that a church is in each broader language group. If we can plant one church in our Doro-speaking area, it can reach the other villages. That's our goal. And so we have another team that's about to go to a place called Pano, which is on the coast. And they're in a different language group. And so they will work to plant a church there. So you can look at it that way, is find somewhere where there isn't a biblical church. You know, it can be a suburb or a town in South Africa or so on. And then that is just thinking of it geographically. Ours are just hard to reach places, right, physically. Johan, yes.
I'm going to cram it in. I've got two questions. Just by the way, we used to speak about creative access nations, not block nations. So creative access nations kind of just using your creativity because you know God's He's opening the doors to those nations anyway. By the way, so one might be a bit of a controversial question. I'd like to know what you think, especially in the fact that you're traveling so much to different countries, to different places. What do you think, looking at the future, how will either getting the jab or not having the jab affect you responding to a call to go to the nations? That being one. The second one is, you mentioned asking questions. How would you say, because usually we're in a context where we are encouraged to preach a lot or teach a lot without necessarily appreciating the questions that causes the follow-up or the causing the deep. So how would you say that has helped you to really take the gospel forward and take the word of God forward into that community in the world?
I'm not so sure on the second question. I don't think I understood it.
So the impact of knowing which questions to ask
of the people in the village.
No, about so you mentioned asking the right questions to make sure they understand. So knowing when to facilitate those questions and the impact it has had in discipling people instead of just preaching or just teaching, one-way communication.
I'll do the jab.
So I'll answer the question too. Yeah, that's why we spend a lot of time just in CLA learning CLA's culture and language acquisition, to learn what the people think about deities in general, what they think about man, what they think about sinfulness, what they think about the solution to man's problem. because those things we try and hit with the actual gospel teaching, the 52 lessons that Zach did. But because those things are so ingrained in their culture, we know that we need to continue to speak into those things and ask questions to make sure that when Zach said certain things, which should scratch against what they believed already, to make sure that they actually understood that it is opposed to what they thought. That they don't just think, oh, this is an additional idea, but that it's actually in contrast to what they used to believe. For example, with God, they would say, if you ask them, hey, who's God? They'd say, oh, I'm God, you're God, we're God. They don't have a biblical idea of who God is. With Jesus, they didn't have a biblical idea of who Jesus is. They merely thought he came to heal sick people and that he's a great example for us to follow. With man and sinfulness, they would have told you 3 things are sin if you ask them. They would say stealing is sin, they would say murder is a sin, and adultery is a sin. And that's the things that they would outline as sinfulness. If you ask them about lying and stuff like that, they're like, no, I don't think those things are sinful things to do. And solution to man's problems, many times I think rituals can cleanse them from their sin. Different kind of rituals that they do, they would say that communion cleanses them from their sin, that if they take communion, it literally washes their sins away. So after the gospel teaching, we spent a lot of time just to make sure that those things communicated well with them. So we would walk around and ask them, hey, what Zach said today about communion, do you understand that communion can't wash away your sin? And we'd hear how they respond. You'd ask them questions like, hey, so what do you believe now? Who goes to heaven? And people, even after the gospel teaching, continue to say, oh, we need to stop doing bad things, we need to start doing good things. And then you read within through passages like John 3, verse 16 to 18, where it's so clear that those who trust in Jesus are the ones who won't be condemned. And you read the scripture and you ask them, based on this scripture, what does it say? And then many times you have to read it again and again, and only the 3rd time they're actually clear, like, oh, the Bible actually says that those who believe in Jesus won't be condemned. And so your asking questions was so crucial, because we can just speak, but if we don't ask them, we think that they understand, but they really don't. Asking them questions like, why is Jesus essential? If Jesus didn't come to earth, died and was resurrected, what would be the implication for you personally? You ask them questions like, hey, you say all people are sinners. What's some of the sins that you need saving from? So just really boiling those questions down, getting those questions to be personal for them to make sure that they understood. So, yeah.
Let me add to what Amelia said is, okay, so we had to learn Melanesian Pidgin so that we could go into the village and then learn their language. Okay, so we had to learn 2 languages. I've stopped at Pidgin because it's hard enough, but for example, Amelia and Alna are learning Ndo. Now, the process that we follow is and I see different cultures here, right? You all have home languages, English, Afrikaans, Zulu, whatever, okay? Now, there's culture and language acquisition. We take our time and we do it thoroughly. We got trained to do it. We have a process we follow. You come in, as you learn the language, you learn the culture. Your language and culture are bound together. Your beliefs and the words you use to describe those beliefs, they're all very important. It would be horrendous if we showed up there, used Pidgin, Melanesian Pidgin, and we just started speaking about the gospel. All they would have gone and said, oh, we've heard those before, and yeah, we believe what you believe. And we'd have missed them totally. There's an element of time, not only for learning the language, we want to tell them the gospel in their own language so that we're communicating it clearly, so that it's clear. I'm pretty sure if you're Afrikaans, you prefer hearing the gospel in Afrikaans. If you're Zulu, the same, and so on. So there's that element, but it takes time. And it takes as many years as necessary to get to that point. I know a guy, David Hogg, it took him 9 years to learn his language. It's a ridiculous language. It's got infixes and prefixes and all kinds of weird things happen in that language. It's all wrong. It's part of Babel. It's the fall, But David stuck it out. And it's then at that point that they started to preach the gospel. And many people people were saved there, and they've actually finished their Bible translation and everything. The timing is in God's hands. We must do it well, though. And so everything Amelia has explained, you need to understand, if you just walk in, show a Jesus movie translated into Pidgin or something, you're not going to know what their beliefs are. What do they have? What do they understand? All the things she just said. And listen, that takes time. Zach did not learn those things. We did not learn those things in month 1. We learned them in year 4. And so the process of the language learning follows a cultural process where it goes from, let me just learn about life. So you learn all the words and you learn about life. Then you move to the next stage. Relationships. You know, how is everyone related? What are you doing? And then the more time you spend with them over that period, things are happening in the village. Babies die. Babies are born. There's fighting. There's like a parish conference. Like things happen. Life happens. And because you're there, you can ask questions. They may or may not open to you and tell you what's going on. Like just before we left, I watched a ritual where young people, they steal Mary, right? A young man and young girl are interested in each other, and they say the man stole the girl. I mean, they're just having physical relations without getting married. That's what's going on. And he basically just took her to his hut, and they both want to be together. And they didn't follow the bride price and the wedding ceremony or whatever. They're just being immoral. They're young teenagers. And the way to solve this was to do a ritual. And I got to watch the whole ritual. And there was all these things involved in washing and whatever. But I could learn through sitting there. What do they believe the problem is? How do they deal with the problem? Does it work? By the way, it didn't. 2 weeks later, they ran for you. But you must go through those things. And specifically, I'm going to give you one example. Zach is doing the lessons, and he translates Bible passages that he's going to teach into law. Something as simple, how do we choose what name to use for God is important. But if we hadn't spent 3-4 years getting to know them, we wouldn't know which terms are loaded with religious significance within their false beliefs. And you may choose not to use certain terms because they're going to go, oh, he's talking about this, and they're going to associate the belief. And that is the problem. I met a missionary from Botswana who told me he had been there for 2 years preaching the gospel, faithful minister, but he realized after 2 years that he was using the wrong word for faith. He was actually using the word for works. So he kept telling the people to be saved by works, and he didn't realize it. It took time. Not a mistake, like not intentional. But so the time is important, and that whole process of learning the culture and that. Listen, God is sovereign over who's living and dying, and we are concerned. People were dying while we're waiting, because we're not preaching the gospel during that period. And for very good reason. Because we may start introducing or saying things that we're going to confuse them. But we do keep saying, remember, we're going to teach God's word. We're going to get there. And we wrote down the questions they had. More often than, like they would come to us, what did you think about this? And then we would say, oh, that's very interesting. Well, what are you thinking about it? And we would draw them out and keep track of that. So that when Zach did teach, we understood what were the main misbeliefs, what the things they had wrong about Christ and God and sin and all those things. And literally from day one, we tore down their entire worldview through the scriptures and built up the biblical picture. That, I mean, Eki, from the beginning, Zach taught that the fruit was literal in Genesis. They believed that what happened there was figurative and Adam and Eve had sex. That's what they believed, some of them. And the moment this one man heard that, and he's an important person in the church, heard that it was literal, he called people to his hut. And he's not a believer, he's just like, whoa, I had this wrong. And he called people to his hut and he started apologizing, saying, I'm sorry, I used to teach that it wasn't literal, but actually it is. You know, and so that's the fruit that slowly builds up. But it's far more important to go through that time and trust God in that period. And then once you preach the gospel, it is exceptionally powerful because you're not only using their language, you're speaking with terms and examples and events that you've experienced with them. And you can illustrate it, and you're just part of life with them, and then they listen. It just makes more sense. You know, if one of them came here and preached in a pulpit and used examples from the bush, we'd all be like, what? Okay, vaccination. I'm going to say the biblical principles of this, right? Paul says in Romans 14, you should not do anything against your conscience, otherwise what's not done in faith is sin. And so if there's a missionary and a guy who's called to go on the field and he finds that, look, he can't actually go because in his conscience he is, I can't take the vaccination, I don't want to do it. He would be sinning if he went and took the vaccination. Now, we must biblically inform our conscience. So a lot of people just stop there, but they don't do the hard work of biblically informing your conscience, and that is hard work. You must do that. And you live out of faith and you trust God with that. God is sovereign over those things, and we trust Him there. Man, I want to be on the missions field. I can't go right now. And this is why. You just keep doing church, right? In your local, do what you can do where you can do it, and trust God with it, and maybe it changes, right? And so I'm not going to go into the vaccination or not.
No.
But for example, we can't go back
Yeah.
if we are not vaccinated.
Yeah.
Okay, Christian.
Yes.
Are there opportunities for short-term missions to come and help you guys, especially with the geographical challenges and language barriers? What would that look like, and how much time should you allow yourself to spend with you guys to really make a difference and to connect with the people?
So let me give you an example. When they built the houses, so the two families that originally moved into the village, we replaced a family. The husband got sick, and we decided to just move in there and carry on the work rather than start a new work. But here's a very good example of how you can do something practical to build a church, right? It was actually the houses needed to be constructed after the village was identified, and the village said, please do come and do your work here. There are two big houses. We live in really nice houses. They're really built out of wood, and structurally they've withstood multiple 7-point-something earthquakes and so on. So, but what they did is, these are Americans, so they brought two short-term missions teams that came out for 2 or 3 weeks. Big teams twice. Of like 15 guys came over at their own cost. And they all had different construction skills, and they built those houses. That's great. That's a practical thing that is part of building the church. That's a very good thing. That is a great short missions team. There's Bethesda, which is an orphan place out in the north. They often have college teams that come and help with the construction of houses and things like that. And okay, so that's orphan care, but that's a good example. Short terms depends on the missionary and his needs. So whatever that might be.
Maybe just to answer you more specifically about us, right now there's just a baby church. So we don't really have a need for someone to come short term to help us with anything, because there's not really much to do. And you hit the nail on the head too, with just the language creates a barrier that you wouldn't be able to communicate with the people. And so when the church is more mature, there might be a need for something, but I can't think of anything specifically now that it would be beneficial. Like, we had considered having Amelia have some friends come and visit her, where it's just purely for the encouragement of the missionary, where it's not that you serve the church in that way, but for the church as a whole. Like, I can't think of anything. Yeah, they might be in the future, and watch this space.
Yeah, so when early on in the ministry there were some visitors, and it's strange for the people in the village to have people come in and they're like, what's these people doing, like why are they here, and then they leave again, and then when I arrived they didn't anticipate that I'm going to stay. They thought I was going to leave again, and they're like, oh, but you're learning the language. Like, it's just was strange for their culture to have people come in so far from our countries, be there for a little while and then leave again. Yeah, they're suspicious. So what happened actually is there was a visitor that came into our village, didn't know the culture, hiked out super early in the morning, accidentally hiked through someone's garden, and he was accused of digging in the ground for minerals. And so the clans had to pay a fee for the people actually to straighten that whole awkward relationship. So superstitious about like, why even with us, they believe that we're there to learn their language, come back to our home country and sell it. We're like, nobody wants to know your language in our home country. So weird beliefs like that, like we're there to steal minerals from the ground, we're there to learn their language, to teach them magic phrases, like how you can teleport from one place to another. Like, even with us, there's just so much superstition, so it was actually wiser to not have visitors come in than to have visitors come in, and it's just weird for them.
Can you guys tell us about some of the difficulties that you've experienced while being there? What are some of the struggles and...
Okay, so the most obvious one, anyone here has done missions or short-term missions or that, you go outside your culture. Even if you've moved out of like a small town into Pretoria or Johannesburg or wherever, there's culture shock. You'll hear this a lot from missionaries. Doesn't matter how well you're prepared for it. When you move to another country, like if you're thinking of immigrating, just be aware of this. And I'm going to have Alna explain, she just read an article that the guy explained it really well, if you remember what he said, yeah. But culture shock was really hard. It took me longer than Alna and Amelia and so on. I think Amelia landed and we basically became a Papua New Guinea. And when she, maybe I should say what they did when you left. So, but culture shock is everything from it's a new language, you don't know what people are saying. We were there for 2 weeks, staying in Medan during Christmas, which is just drinking and crime, and it's like really rough. And we were attacked by 11 armed men, from like, some of them looked like kids to adults. A guy tried to shoot me with a handmade gun. Fortunately, often even when they have real guns, they don't have bullets. But that happened to us, and you know what? I couldn't call the police. First of all, didn't know their number, couldn't speak pidgin, wouldn't have helped, and don't know if they even would have answered. Right? You're just at that. I had no weapons with me. I didn't have a stick. Like, I had nothing. Right? God was gracious. Yeah. I mean, I had Sebastian's lighter. And use the force, I guess. But the fact is, you know, God used that and that. But like, you want culture shock? That's crazy. Like, you don't know what to do, you can't speak to anyone, like, you just, it's me and God at that point, which is, thankfully, is Lord of all the earth, and then you guys have been through something, right? It was just near then, and I read your letter, it was very helpful, thank you, you didn't know that, but we went through that, and you know, that's part of culture shock. It took me 2 years to get through it, so it was really hard, especially the language thing, and just like, I'm going to have Alna explain something to you about culture shock that actually describes it very well.
So if you just think of your brain and physiology, there are just tons of decisions that we make every day, right? Millions of decisions, like what am I going to wear, what am I going to say to this person, am I going to look this person in the eye? There are just millions of decisions that we make every day, and most of that you do on autopilot. Like you go to your car, we even drive on autopilot, which is kind of dangerous. Yeah. It's not a nice thought. But we do a ton of things on autopilot, and as soon as you move into a different culture, you don't have that luxury. You actually just make a ton of those decisions become